I never imagined my life would end up as one of those cautionary tales. You know the kind. The ones you hear about on the news or see in documentaries. The kind where everything seems fine on the surface, and then, without warning, it all shatters. My family? We were unbreakable, or so I thought. But everything changed the moment my mom met him. His name was Charlie. He was everything anyone would look for in a partner. Charming, thoughtful, the kind of guy who could brighten anyone's day with just a smile. I remember when my mom first introduced him to me. She was glowing, telling me about a new guy she met at her yoga class. I thought, okay, sure, maybe this is it for her. Maybe she'll be happy again. After all, my mom had been through a tough divorce a year before, and I wanted nothing more than to see her smile again. But when Charlie started hanging around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At first, it was just little things, harmless things, like how he'd always open the door for her, how he'd bring her flowers without any occasion, or how he'd insist on helping around the house with all the little tasks. He seemed too good to be true. And yet, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. He seemed so perfect, especially for my mom, who had been through so much. I figured maybe he was just trying to be kind and supportive, or maybe I was just too cautious. But over time, I began to notice small signs, things that made my gut twist. One Saturday afternoon, when my mom was out running errands, Charlie offered to help me with some schoolwork. I was sitting at the kitchen table, looking over some history notes when he sat down next to me. At first, his compliments were typical. "You're a lot more focused than most kids your age," he said with that smile of his. It felt nice, but then, as he continued, his words took a turn I couldn't ignore. "You're so mature," he remarked, leaning in a little too close for comfort. "Most kids your age are obsessed with TV shows and games. But you're different. You have a real future ahead of you." The comment felt strange. It wasn't just what he said, but the way he said it. His eyes lingered a little longer than usual, and I could almost feel them following me. I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. It could just be awkward conversation, right? After all, he was just being friendly, I told myself. But something inside me wasn't convinced. As the days went by, Charlie's behavior became harder to ignore. At first, his attention seemed harmless, maybe even endearing. But there was something in the way he always found a reason to compliment me. It started small. "You have such a mature perspective for your age," he'd say during family dinners when I offered my opinions. "You're wise beyond your years," he'd add with that all-too-familiar smile. I tried to dismiss it at first. After all, Charlie wasn't doing anything overtly wrong. He wasn't crossing any lines, yet. But it was the timing, the way he would always pick those moments when my mom wasn't around, that left me feeling uneasy. It was like he was trying to get closer in some way, to form a connection that didn't feel entirely natural. One evening, my mom had to work late, and Charlie suggested we watch a movie together. He was the type to pick something lighthearted, comedy mostly, but that night, the way he chose the film and the way he acted made everything feel off. I sat on one end of the couch, trying to put some space between us. But Charlie seemed to ignore the unspoken boundary. As the movie played, I could feel his eyes on me. It wasn't just the occasional glance. It was the kind of look that lingered too long. He made comments about how I laughed, how I looked when I was focused on the film. "You know, you're so beautiful when you laugh," he said one time. It was the way he said it that made me tense up. It wasn't playful or innocent. It was loaded with something I couldn't quite understand. I forced a smile and tried to laugh it off, but the tension in my chest wouldn't go away. Every time he spoke to me, I could feel my stomach knotting. How could I tell my mom about this? Nothing about it felt like a clear-cut problem. Charlie hadn't done anything obviously inappropriate, but the way he was acting made me feel uncomfortable in my own home. It wasn't just during the movie either. Over the next few days, the compliments kept coming. So much so that I began to wonder if they were part of some strategy to make me feel special, to make me feel noticed in a way that wasn't typical for a stepdad. "You've got such an amazing future ahead of you," he said once, his tone softer than usual. "You really are something special." Each time he said something like that, I tried to tell myself that maybe he was just being kind. After all, I'd known him for months by now, and he'd never really done anything wrong. But the way he'd look at me, the way his words lingered a little too long, it made me start to question if I was seeing things that weren't there. One night, after another awkward dinner with Charlie, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I tried to convince myself that it was just me being paranoid. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The more time passed, the more I began to realize that I couldn't just keep brushing off Charlie's behavior. I started to notice small, subtle shifts in the way he treated me. It wasn't always obvious at first, but I could feel it. The shift in his tone, the look in his eyes. Things I hadn't noticed before now stood out like flashing red lights. One afternoon, my mom was out running errands, and Charlie was sitting at the kitchen table. I was in the living room, flipping through a magazine when he casually asked, "Do you need help with your homework?" I didn't want to seem rude, so I agreed, though I wasn't really interested in his company. He was always trying to help with my schoolwork, but it wasn't that simple. As we sat down together, he started complimenting me again, but this time, it wasn't just my intelligence. You really know how to keep things together for someone your age," he said, his voice warm but a little too personal. "Most kids would be falling apart after everything you've been through. You're a lot more mature than anyone realizes." I smiled politely, but my stomach churned. Sure, it sounded like a compliment, but it didn't feel right. There was always something in the way he said things, something that made my skin crawl. As he spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was trying to dig deeper, to find a way to connect with me on a level that didn't feel like a normal parent-child relationship. There was always that lingering gaze, the way he would focus on me just a little too intently. My mind screamed at me to stop overthinking it, but my body wasn't listening. I felt trapped, stuck in this uncomfortable dynamic that I couldn't escape. That night, after another dinner where Charlie had been his usual charming self, I found myself questioning everything. Was I imagining things? Was I reading too much into his behavior? Or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface? Later, as I was lying in bed, I thought about all the small moments I'd noticed. The compliments, the lingering glances, the way he'd always try to be near me when my mom wasn't around. It wasn't just that he was trying to be a good stepdad. There was an underlying current of something else, something more troubling. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking, the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. If anything, it was growing. It all came to a head one evening when my mom had to work late again. Charlie, of course, suggested we watch a movie together. This time, I wasn't in the mood to go along with it, but my mom had mentioned how important it was for us to spend family time, so I reluctantly agreed. We settled in the living room, the couch between us feeling like an ocean. I sat on one end, and he sat on the other, but his presence was inescapable. It wasn't the movie itself that made my heart race. It was the way Charlie kept finding reasons to invade my space, to make his presence known. "Wow, you're really into this, huh?" he said as I laughed at something on the screen. "You've got such a great sense of humor for someone your age." It wasn't a compliment. It felt like an observation, one that was meant to make me feel seen, maybe even admired. But at that moment, I felt anything but. Every time he spoke to me, I felt like I was shrinking, like I was being put under a microscope. Charlie's behavior had become more unsettling by the day, but there was one moment that night that pushed me past my breaking point. As we neared the end of the movie, I stood up to grab a drink of water. I was trying to keep things casual, trying to maintain the sense of normalcy that had started slipping away from me. As I was about to leave the room, Charlie called out in that soft, almost too casual voice of his. "You know," he said, "if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm always here. About anything. You can trust me." His words hit me like a ton of bricks. They felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. The way he said it, the way he made sure to stress the word anything, made my skin crawl. I froze at the foot of the stairs, my heart pounding. I felt trapped, paralyzed. I couldn't bring myself to say anything, so I just muttered a quick, "Thanks," and rushed upstairs, locking the door behind me. That night, I lay in bed wide awake, my mind spinning. Was I overreacting? Was I just being paranoid? But I knew deep down that this was more than just a few awkward interactions. This wasn't normal. Something was wrong, and I could feel it in every fiber of my being. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. Why had Charlie said that? Why had he looked at me that way? It wasn't the first time I'd felt this way around him, but this time, it was different. This time, something inside me snapped. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to figure out what was going on, no matter how painful it might be. The next few days felt like a blur of anxiety and tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time Charlie spoke to me, I felt like I was walking on eggshells, trying not to provoke him or make things worse. The comments, the stares, the way he'd always seemed to show up when my mom wasn't around, it was all becoming too much. Then, one afternoon, an opportunity came that I couldn't ignore. My mom had gone out with some friends, leaving Charlie and me alone at the house. At first, I tried to stay in my room and avoid him, but I knew that wouldn't work. Charlie always found a way to get my attention, to pull me into conversations when I least expected it. That day, I was in the kitchen, looking for a snack when I heard him call out from the living room. "Hey, could you come here for a second?" His voice sounded casual, but I felt a knot form in my stomach. I hesitated but eventually walked into the living room, where he was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. As I stood there, unsure of what to do, Charlie looked up and smiled. "You always seem so busy, like you're hiding away from the world." He patted the empty spot next to him. "Come sit with me. Let's talk for a bit." My heart raced. I didn't want to sit with him. I didn't want to be near him. But I didn't know how to refuse without making things awkward. So, I reluctantly sat down, keeping as much space between us as possible. The conversation started innocently enough. Charlie asked about my day, how school was going, and what my plans were for the weekend. But then, as usual, the compliments began to creep in. "You know," he said, "you're a lot more mature than most kids your age. You don't just talk about things, you actually think them through. It's impressive." I forced a smile, but the words felt hollow, coming from him. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending everything was fine. Then, just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, Charlie leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a softer tone. "You're really something special," he said. "You deserve to be appreciated for who you are." I froze. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the way he said them, the way his eyes lingered on me. My skin crawled. There was something wrong with the way he was looking at me, like I wasn't just his stepdaughter anymore. I wanted to run, to escape, but I didn't know how. And then it happened. In a swift motion, Charlie reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. My body went rigid. I shot to my feet, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what to say, how to react. I stumbled over my words as I mumbled, "I've got homework," and hurried upstairs to my room, locking the door behind me. I sat there in the silence, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. This wasn't just awkward anymore. It wasn't just a few uncomfortable comments. This was something far more sinister, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. The days that followed were filled with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. I couldn't look at Charlie without feeling like he was hiding something dark. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't escape the feeling that he was watching me, tracking my every move. My mind raced constantly, replaying every interaction, trying to make sense of everything. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal. I needed proof. I needed something concrete to show my mom, something that couldn't be ignored, something that would finally make her see the truth. The opportunity came one afternoon when Charlie left his phone unattended on the kitchen counter. My heart pounded as I stared at it. I knew it wasn't right to invade his privacy, but what other choice did I have? I had to know the truth. I glanced outside to see him in the yard, his back turned. My chance was fleeting. I took a deep breath and grabbed the phone. My hands trembled as I unlocked it without a password. Relief flooded over me as I scrolled through the texts and emails. At first, everything appeared normal. Too normal. It almost felt like I was overreacting. But then I stumbled upon his photo gallery. There, in the gallery, were dozens of pictures of me. Some were from family outings. Others were taken around the house. But what really made my stomach turn were the ones I didn't know about. The ones where I wasn't aware of the camera. There I was, reading in the living room, standing in the kitchen, walking down the hall. They weren't explicit, but they were private. They were intimate. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Why had he taken these pictures? Why did he feel the need to document my every move without my consent? Just as I was processing what I'd found, I heard the sound of the back door closing. My heart stopped. Panicking, I quickly placed the phone back in its original position and ran upstairs, my mind racing. Once I was safely in my room, I sat on my bed, hands shaking as I tried to make sense of everything. I had what I needed. Proof that Charlie's behavior wasn't just inappropriate, it was obsessive. But what should I do with it? How could I show my mom something so unsettling without tearing our family apart? The doubt and guilt gnawed at me. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore what I had discovered. I couldn't let Charlie's twisted behavior continue. I had to tell someone. But who could I trust with this kind of secret? The discovery of Charlie's photos left me feeling sick to my stomach. Every part of me wanted to run, to tell my mom everything and put an end to this madness. But I knew the consequences of doing so wouldn't be simple. My mom was head over heels for Charlie. She saw him as the man who could fix everything, the one who made her happy after everything she'd been through. And me? I was just the kid in the background. The one who had to figure out how to deal with the mess without ruining everything. But that night, as I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized that I couldn't stay silent anymore. I couldn't let this go on. The weight of the photos I'd found pressed down on me with a suffocating force. I had to act. I thought about telling my mom, but I knew that would be a struggle. Would she believe me? Would she even listen to me? Or would she just see me as the rebellious teenager who didn't understand her relationship? I couldn't risk that. I needed more than just the photos. I needed undeniable evidence that Charlie had crossed a line he could never come back from. And then it hit me. I knew the perfect opportunity would come again, and this time, I'd have everything I needed to expose him for who he truly was. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of determination. I needed to act fast before Charlie figured out that I was onto him. My plan was simple. Find more proof, and this time, make sure it couldn't be ignored. I wasn't going to sit back and wait for things to get worse. I couldn't. It wasn't long before I got my chance. One evening, after Charlie had left his laptop open on the dining table while he stepped outside to take a phone call, I knew this was it. I walked past the table, trying to act casual, but my heart was pounding in my chest. I sat down at the table, my hands shaking as I opened the laptop. I quickly scanned through his email inbox, hoping to find something that would prove he wasn't just an innocent stepdad, that there was something more sinister lurking beneath the surface. At first, the emails looked normal. Work-related stuff, nothing unusual. But then I opened the drafts folder. And there it was. An email. Untitled. Unsent. The words hit me like a freight train. I don't know how much longer I can hide this. It's getting harder to pretend everything is fine. There's someone I can't stop thinking about, and it's driving me crazy. I know it's wrong, but I can't help the way I feel. I froze. The email was vague, but the implications were unmistakable. Was he talking about me? Was he confessing something he couldn't say out loud,